In a quiet part of the animal shelter, a sad lynx cat named Luca kept crying because he missed his owner. His family, heartbroken, had left him there, not knowing how much he was suffering at night. One day, Dr. Scott White was checking Luca when he saw something strange on his collar. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he read the tag again. Suddenly, his expression changed, his eyes widened in shock. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Quickly, he called his assistant. Emma rushed in. "What's wrong, Dr. White?" she asked, her eyes darting from him to Luca, still curled up in the corner. Scott hesitated before answering. "Are you sure the woman who brought him in said his last name was Carter?" Emma frowned. "Yeah, she said her name was Grace Carter and his was Francis." "Why?" Scott's pulse quickened. "That's not what the tag says." Luca lay curled in the farthest corner of his kennel, his tufted ears flattened, his golden eyes dull with grief. Unlike other animals who eventually adjusted to shelter life, Luca refused to eat or interact. He barely moved, only letting out soft, mournful cries that echoed through the quiet space at night. Grace Carter, the widow of Luca's late owner, had brought him in with tears in her eyes, explaining her family's struggle to care for him. "He only ever listened to Francis," she had said, her voice breaking. "We tried, but he won't stop looking for him." Dr. Scott White had seen many grieving pets, but something about Luca felt different, unsettling, even. The lynx cat wasn't just mourning, he was guarding something. Every attempt to remove his worn leather collar was met with a sharp hiss and flashing claws. Scott knelt by Luca's kennel, his mind racing. What was this cat holding on to? Why did the tag on his collar feel wrong? A flicker of suspicion crept into Scott's thoughts. Luca wasn't just grieving, he might be hiding a secret. Scott's breath hitched as he finally caught a clear glimpse of the tag. For days, Luca had refused to let anyone near his collar, but now, with careful patience, Scott had managed to tilt it just enough to read the engraving. His heart pounded. The name etched into the metal wasn't Francis Carter. It wasn't even remotely close. Scott's pulse quickened as he traced the faint, worn-out letters with his thumb. Could he be reading it wrong? He blinked, adjusting the angle under the dim shelter lights. No, there was no mistake. This isn't right, he muttered under his breath. The realization sent a chill down his spine. If Luca wasn't originally Francis's pet, then who did he belong to? And why had his real identity been erased? The pieces of a mystery far deeper than he had expected were beginning to fall into place. Scott sat at his desk, Luca's record spread before him, a deep frown creasing his forehead. Something wasn't adding up. According to the paperwork, Luca had been a registered pet for 6 years, but one glance at the lynx told Scott he was much older. A lynx's lifespan could stretch beyond 15 years, and Luca's weathered fur and piercing eyes hinted at a past far longer than what was recorded. Had he belonged to someone else before Francis? If so, why had that history been erased? Flipping through Luca's medical reports, Scott noticed another oddity. His earliest checkups at the clinic were unusually vague, with missing details about his origin. It was as if his life before 6 years ago had been wiped clean. Scott leaned back, staring at Luca's kennel across the room. The lynx had finally dozed off, his body still curled protectively around the collar. He was guarding something, Scott was sure of it now. Determined, Scott grabbed his car keys and jacket. If there were answers, they weren't in these files. "I'll be back soon," he told Emma, his voice tinged with urgency. Emma raised an eyebrow. "Where are you going?" Scott hesitated before responding. "To the Carter estate." The shelter's fluorescent lights flickered as he strode toward the exit, Luca's mournful cries still echoing in his mind. Whatever the truth was, Scott was determined to find it. The Carter estate loomed ahead, its tall iron gates creaking as Scott stepped onto the cobblestone path. The mansion's eerie silence only deepened his unease. He knocked firmly, and after a brief pause, Jane Carter answered. She looked surprised to see him. "Dr. White," she asked. Is something wrong? Scott hesitated. I need to check something about Luca. Jane frowned but stepped aside, leading him into the grand hallway adorned with portraits. As they walked, Scott's eyes landed on an oil painting of Francis Carter. But it wasn't the man that caught his attention, it was the lynx in the background. It was Luca. But his collar looked different. Do you have any old photos of Luca? Scott asked. Jane nodded and retrieved a dusty leather album. Flipping through the pages, Scott's breath caught. There was a picture of Luca as a younger lynx, sitting beside Francis. But the name on the collar tag was crystal clear, and it wasn't Carter. Scott ran his finger over the faded ink below the photograph, Emily Harrington, 2017. His mind reeled. Jane, he said slowly, his voice measured. Do you know who Emily Harrington is? Jane paled. No, but if Luca wasn't always ours, then whose was he? Scott exhaled. This mystery was deeper than he had imagined. Scott sat in his car, his fingers drumming anxiously against the steering wheel. A quick online search had led him to Emily Harrington, whose name matched the one on Luca's old collar. Her address wasn't far. Dialing her number, he took a deep breath as the call connected. Hello, a woman's voice answered, cautious yet polite. Emily Harrington? Scott asked. I think I might have found your lynx. A long silence followed. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, You found Luca? Scott's grip tightened on the phone. Luca? That was his name before I lost him, she choked out. 6 years ago, during a move. He vanished. I searched everywhere, put up flyers, but he was gone. Scott's heart pounded. Can you come to the clinic? Emily arrived within the hour, her hands trembling as she stepped inside. Scott led her down the hallway toward the kennel. As they reached Luca's enclosure, the lynx let out a sharp, defensive cry, but the moment his golden eyes met Emily's, something changed. His ears perked up. His tense posture softened. Emily hesitated. Luca, she whispered, extending a shaking hand. For a moment, nothing. Then, Luca moved toward her, pressing his forehead against her palm. A deep, rumbling purr vibrated through his chest. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she ran her fingers through his fur. It's really you. Scott exhaled, watching as the lynx melted into her touch, his sorrow finally lifting. But before the moment could settle, a voice called from the lobby. Dr. White? Scott turned. Grace Carter was here. Scott turned to see Grace Carter standing at the front desk, her hands clasped tightly. There was a mix of anxiety and determination in her eyes. I heard you found a lynx, she said softly. Is it Luca? Scott hesitated, glancing back at Emily, who was still stroking Luca's fur. The lynx purred, a sound filled with deep recognition and comfort. Emily turned, her eyes still glistening with tears. Grace's gaze dropped to Luca, and for a moment, an unspoken pain passed between the two women. I lost him years ago, Emily whispered. He was mine before he ever belonged to Francis. Grace inhaled sharply, clutching her purse strap. Francis never told me. He just found Luca and cared for him. He thought he was abandoned. A heavy silence followed. Neither woman had been at fault, yet both had lost and loved the same animal. Scott finally spoke. Maybe Luca doesn't have to choose. Grace and Emily exchanged glances. Could they share him? Grace sighed. Francis loved him, and I do too. But I see how he looks at you. Emily smiled weakly. Maybe we can figure something out. After a long pause, they nodded, a silent agreement that Luca would always have 2 families, 2 homes, and endless love. Scott watched, feeling an unexpected warmth settle in his chest. Sometimes, love isn't about choosing. It's about sharing. Luca, now free from sorrow, brushed against both women, as if he understood. For the first time in weeks, he didn't cry. Luca now had 2 homes, 2 families, and more love than ever before. He split his time between Grace and Emily, no longer bound by loss but embraced by those who truly cared for him. Scott watched as the Lynx thrived in his new life, his once mournful cries replaced with contented purrs. Sometimes, love isn't about choosing, it's about sharing. What do you think? Did they make the right decision? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed Luca's story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. See you in the next video.